Phnom Penh, Cambodia, April 17th, 1975. 7 o'clock in the morning. The streets were crowded. People had come out of their homes and into the roads, standing on doorsteps and balconies, craning their necks toward the distant sound that had been getting louder for hours. After 5 years of civil war, 5 years of bombing runs and artillery in the slow, suffocating siege of a city that had swelled with refugees until it could barely breathe, the sound of weapons falling silent felt, to the exhausted people of Phnom Penh, like the sound of peace. The soldiers who marched into the city that morning were young, extraordinarily young. Some of them looked no older than 14 or 15. They wore black pajama uniforms and checkered scarves. They carried rifles that seemed almost too large for their frames. Their faces were expressionless in a way that some of the people watching from the roadsides found puzzling. Not the faces of victorious soldiers, not the faces of men who had just won a war, but something blank and absolute, like the faces of people who had been taught to feel only one thing. People in the crowd raised their hands. Some smiled. A woman held out fruit. A man called out a greeting. The young soldiers did not respond. They marched. They fanned out through the streets with a precision that was not the improvised chaos of a guerrilla army taking a city for the first time, but the executed plan of something that had known exactly what was going to do long before it got here. By 7:30 in the morning, loudspeakers mounted on Lambretta scooters began moving through the streets. The message that came through them was delivered in a calm, almost cheerful voice. There had been a victory. The voice said, Cambodia was liberated, but there was a danger. The Americans were preparing airstrikes. For the safety of the population, everyone needed to leave the city, just temporarily. 3 days, perhaps. They should not bring too many things. By 7:45, the soldiers began entering the narrow alleys between buildings. They knocked on doors, or they didn't bother knocking. They told families to leave. Now, immediately, those who hesitated were shown the rifle. Those who refused were shot where they stood. The evacuation was not chaos. That is the most important thing to understand about what happened in Phnom Penh on April 17th, 1975. It was not the breakdown of order. It was order meticulously applied in the service of something that the people on those roads, clutching their children in their bags and their most precious objects, could not yet see fully. What they were being walked into was not a temporary shelter from American bombs. It was a machine, and the machine had been designed by a single man who had spent 20 years in the jungle dreaming of exactly this moment, to consume everything that Cambodia had ever been and replace it with something that had never existed anywhere on Earth. His name was Pol Pot, and almost nobody knew what he looked like. The man who would become Pol Pot was born Salasar on May 19, 1925, in the small village of Prexpov in the Kampong Tom province of Cambodia, then part of French Indochina. He came from a family that was, by the standards of the Cambodian countryside, relatively comfortable. His father owned approximately 50 acres of rice paddy, roughly 10 times the national average. The family was well-connected enough that one of Salasar's cousins was a dancer at the royal palace in Phnom Penh, and an elder brother worked within the palace household. At 5 or 6 years old, he was sent to live with that brother in Phnom Penh, where he would be educated in the French colonial curriculum. He spent a year in a Buddhist monastery, a common practice in Cambodian society that gave children their first exposure to formal discipline and religious education. He was not, by any account, a remarkable student. He was described as pleasant, quiet, even gentle by people who knew him during those years. He had a smile that people remembered as warm. He liked football and, later, music. He played a traditional Cambodian instrument with some skill. He failed the entrance examinations for secondary school. That failure redirected him to a technical school where he studied carpentry. And then, in 1949, at the age of 20, a scholarship arrived for radio electronics to be studied in Paris. He boarded the ship to France with a particular kind of young man's ambition that is looking for something without knowing yet what it is. He arrived in Paris in an era when the city was, for young intellectuals from colonized countries around the world, a cauldron of political ideas that had been simmering since the war. Sartre, Camus, Marx translated into every language. The French Communist Party, at the height of its post-war influence, Vietnamese and Algerian and Cambodian students crowded into cheap rooms on the left bank, arguing about imperialism and revolution, and what a free nation might look like if it were ever given a chance to be one. Salazar stopped studying radioelectronics almost immediately. He had found something more interesting than circuits. He had found ideology. He joined the French Communist Party. He threw himself into study groups and pamphlets and the electric company of people who were certain that history had a direction and that they were going to be the ones who pushed it there. He read Marx and Lenin. He read Mao Zedong's writings on agrarian revolution with the particular intensity of a Cambodian who grew up watching peasants work rice paddies under a colonial sun. He became convinced, and this conviction would never leave him, that the pure future of Cambodia lay not in the cities, not in the French-educated elite, not in the monarchy or the commerce or the Buddhism that had shaped the country for centuries, but in the peasants, the uncorrupted workers of the land, the people who had not been touched by modernity, by education, by anything that could be called Western influence. He lost his scholarship because he had stopped attending his courses. He was sent back to Cambodia in 1953, carrying ideas that would take 2 more decades to find their full, terrible expression. Back in Cambodia, a country just finding its way out of French colonial rule under King Norodom Sihanouk, Salazar moved into the shadows. He joined the clandestine communist underground. He taught school for a time, French literature and history and civics to students who would later describe him as a genuinely beloved teacher, patient, kind, idealistic. They had no idea what he believed when he went home at night. They had no idea what he was building in the jungle, because that is where it was being built. In the jungle, through the 1960s, as Sihanouk navigated the impossible politics of a small country trapped between the American war in Vietnam and Chinese communist ambitions, the organization that would become the Khmer Rouge was forming in the remote northeastern provinces of Cambodia, in territory so sparsely populated and so physically inaccessible that the government could not easily reach them. Salazar was their leader. By 1963, he had gone underground entirely, disappeared so completely that his own family did not know for years whether he was alive or dead. He took a nom de guerre, Pol Pot, a name that sounded almost like nothing, compact and opaque, that revealed nothing about the man behind it. That anonymity was intentional. He cultivated it. For years, even within the Khmer Rouge itself, only the innermost circle knew who Brother Number One really was. The others knew only that there was a leader somewhere in the jungle and that he had a vision. The vision was this: Cambodia would be reborn. Everything that existed, the cities, the money, the schools, the temples, the social hierarchies, the foreign influences, would be erased. In their place would arise a pure agrarian society of peasant workers, organized into collectives, producing rice, owing nothing to the outside world, connected to nothing but the soil and the revolutionary discipline of party. It was a vision that owed debts to Mao's Cultural Revolution in China, to the Khmer Syrian nationalist movement, to the radical strains of French communism Pol Pot had absorbed in Paris. But it was also something that no theoretical framework quite accounted for, a vision so absolute in its rejection of the existing world that it could only be implemented through violence on a scale that its architect, apparently, never doubted was necessary. The American bombing of Cambodia gave him his army. Between 1969 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 2.7 million tons of bombs on Cambodian territory, more than all the bombs dropped by the Allied powers during the entire Second World War. The stated purpose was to destroy North Vietnamese supply routes and sanctuaries. The actual effect in the Cambodian countryside where the bombs fell was to destroy villages, kill tens of thousands of civilians, and generate a fury among the surviving rural population that the Khmer Rouge transformed into recruits. Young men and women who had watched American planes turn their villages into craters walked into the jungle and joined the organization that promised to burn the corrupt world to the ground and build something clean in its place. By 1973, the Khmer Rouge had grown from a few hundred fighters to an army of tens of thousands. They were taking territory. They were winning. By April 1975, after the American-backed government of Lon Nol had collapsed under the combined weight of corruption, military failure, and the withdrawal of American support, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh, and the machine began. Within 72 hours of taking the city, Phnom Penh, a metropolis of nearly 2.5 million people, was empty. 2.5 million people, driven out of their homes, into the roads, into the heat of the Cambodian dry season, told to walk to the countryside. No destination given. No timeline. No exceptions. Patients were taken from their hospital beds. Those who could not walk were wheeled on gurneys into the streets, pushed by family members who were themselves being pushed by soldiers. People attached intravenous drips to poles tied to bicycle handlebars and kept moving. Those who collapsed were left where they fell. Those who argued were shot. Dr. Haing Inger, a physician who had survived the regime and later won an Academy Award for his role in the film The Killing Fields, described those first days with the precision of someone who spent years trying to make sense of the senseless. The streets of Phnom Penh, he wrote, were filled from one side to the other. The air was stifling. People died on the roads. Others were shot because they could not walk fast enough. The evacuation was not disorganized. It was the first policy of a new state. Pol Pot's vision of Year Zero. The Khmer Rouge declared April 17, 1975, to be the literal beginning of history. Year Zero of a new calendar required the elimination of everything the old world had been. Cities were the concentrations of everything the regime hated: money, commerce, education, class distinction, foreign influence. To empty them was not merely a logistical operation. It was an ideological statement. We are starting again. We are beginning from nothing. And you, whoever you were before today, are nothing now. The banks were dynamited. Currency was abolished. The concept of private property was declared non-existent. Markets were closed. Schools were shut. Teachers were told their profession no longer existed. Temples were emptied. Monks were stripped of their robes and sent to work in the fields like everyone else. The entire country was divided into collectives, enormous labor camps where the population was sorted into categories and assigned to work. There were old people, the rural Cambodians who had already been living under Khmer Rouge control in the liberated zones, who were considered pure, ideologically reliable. And there were new people, the evacuees from the cities, who were considered contaminated by capitalism, education, or foreign contact, and who were therefore the lowest category human being in the new democratic Kampuchea. Being a new person was dangerous enough. Having a particular profession was potentially a death sentence. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, civil servants. Anyone whose work had required education was a target. The Khmer Rouge's theory was not complicated. Educated people think. Thinking people ask questions. Questioning people resist. Therefore, educated people must be eliminated. The identification methods were crude and absolute. Do you speak a foreign language? Do you have soft hands, the hands of someone who has not done agricultural labor? Do you wear glasses? The wearing of glasses became, in the folklore of survival in democratic Kampuchea, a mark of danger, a sign that you had read enough to need them, a sign of the intellect that the regime had decided to treat as a crime. In the rice paddies of the Northwest, in the sugar palm plantations, in the work camps that stretched across the country, the new people labored 18 hours a day on rations that amounted to starvation. A small bowl of rice soup, sometimes just one can of rice distributed to 10 or 15 people, for an entire day of agricultural work in the Cambodian sun. People ate insects, bark, grass. They searched the ground for anything that could go into a mouth. They died of exhaustion, of malnutrition, of the diseases that fester in bodies with no immune reserves left. They were shot for eating a crab or a fish they had caught while working in the paddies, because food production was collective and individual consumption was theft from the state. Children were taken from their families and placed in youth groups, indoctrinated, weaponized, taught to spy on their parents and report counter-revolutionary behavior to the anchor, the organization, the faceless bureaucratic name that the Khmer Rouge used to describe itself and its authority. Parents learned to be afraid of their own children. Families learned to eat in silence, because words have become the most dangerous things in the world. At the center of this system, in Phnom Penh, now a ghost city where the empty streets were patrolled by Khmer Rouge soldiers and the silence was broken only by the distant sounds of work and suffering from the countryside, was a building that had once been a high school. Tul Svay Prey High School was a pleasant-looking structure in a pleasant-looking neighborhood. It had classrooms and a courtyard, and the feeling of a place where children had once learned things. The Khmer Rouge renamed it S-21. Comrade Dutch, Kane Gwek, a former mathematics teacher and deputy school principal, was placed in command. What was constructed inside that building was a factory of confession. The Khmer Rouge's paranoia, and it was paranoia, the self-devouring paranoia of a regime so certain of enemies that it began to manufacture them when real ones ran short, required documentation. It required names. The organization believed it was surrounded by traitors, by CIA agents, by Vietnamese spies, by counter-revolutionaries who had infiltrated the party. It needed confessions. It needed the names of accomplices. The method was torture. Prisoners arrived at S-21 in trucks, blindfolded, shackled, stripped of everything they had been. They were photographed. The black and white photographs that would survive as one of the most haunting archives of the 20th century. Thousands of faces staring directly into the camera, men and women and children, some with expressions of terror, and some with expressions of exhaustion, and some with expressions of a vacancy that comes after the mind has processed so much horror that it has stopped processing. The photographs are there now. Visitors to the Tuol-Sleng Genocide Museum walk the walls where those faces are mounted, and there is no preparation adequate to what that experience is. The confessions extracted in S-21 followed a template. Every prisoner was a traitor. Every prisoner had been recruited by foreign intelligence, the CIA, the Vietnamese, the Soviet KGB. Every prisoner named accomplices, because naming accomplices was the only thing that slowed or temporarily interrupted the torture. The accomplices were then arrested. They named more accomplices. The circle grew. By the end of the regime, S-21 had processed between 17,000 and 20,000 prisoners. The number who survived is not estimated. It is known exactly because it is so small. 7 people walked out of S-21 alive because they had skills the regime found temporarily useful, a painter, an artist, people whose hands could create things the organization wanted created. Everyone else was transported at night, shackled and blindfolded, to a place 15 kilometers from the city. The prisoners were told, according to guard testimony given decades later at the ECCC tribunal, that they were being moved to new homes, that they were being transferred. A former guard named him Hui testified that the prisoners, sometimes up to 100 of them in a single night, were taken to the pits in groups, forced to kneel, and killed with ox guard axles struck against the backs of their necks, then their throats slashed. Bullets were expensive. The organization was frugal. The place was Choang Ek, the place the world would come to know as the Killing Fields. It is not a dramatic place. Physically, it is a quiet field about 30 minutes outside Phnom Penh, with sugar palm trees and long grass and a Buddhist stupa at its center that is filled floor to ceiling with human skulls. Approximately 9,000 bodies were exhumed from the mass graves at Choang Ek alone. Across the country, hundreds of similar sites exist. The Documentation Center Cambodia has identified over 20,000 mass grave sites distributed across every province. There is a tree at Choang Ek that visitors stop in front of. A placard explains that it was used to kill children. The Khmer Rouge philosophy extended to youngest. To kill the grass, you must remove the roots. The roots were the children of enemies, the children of the educated, the children of anyone who had been designated as a threat. They were held by their ankles and swung against the tree trunk. The tree is still there. The Khmer Rouge turned inward with the same ferocity it had turned outward. By 1977, the paranoia that had always been structural to regime had consumed its own ranks. Senior officials who had been loyal since the jungle years were arrested, brought to S-21, tortured until they confessed to being CIA agents or Vietnamese spies, and executed. The purges moved through the eastern zone, the region of Cambodia closest to the Vietnamese border, with particular savagery. Soldiers and cadres who had had contact with Vietnamese forces during the years of alliance against Lon Nol were now considered contaminated. Hundreds of thousands of Cambodians in the eastern zone were killed or relocated. The Khmer Rouge was, in this period, killing more Cambodians per capita than almost any regime in recorded history. And Pol Pot, who had finally revealed himself in 1977, appearing for the first time publicly as the leader of Democratic Kampuchea, was convinced that everything was going according to plan. He believed, or claimed to believe, that the deaths were necessary, that the pain of transformation was the birth pain of the new world, that in a generation, perhaps two, the pure agrarian society he had dreamed of in Paris would have taken root, and the suffering would be justified by what grew from it. What was actually growing was collapse. The forced collectivization produced chronic food shortages, because ideology does not grow rice. The elimination of every educated person in the country had destroyed the administrative capacity to manage even basic infrastructure. Roads deteriorated. The irrigation systems that Cambodian agriculture depended on fell into disrepair. People were starving in a country that had once been the rice basket of Southeast Asia because the rice they grew was being exported to China in exchange for military support, while the workers who grew it ate watery soup. The border with Vietnam was becoming a war. Pol Pot's regime had launched raids into Vietnamese territory, driven partly by an ancient Khmer nationalism that viewed Vietnamese expansion as an existential threat, and partly by the paranoid logic that said the eastern zone's contamination by Vietnamese influence had to be answered with violence. Vietnam, which had its own history, its own interests, and a military that had just finished defeating the United States, responded. In December 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge Army, gutted by internal purges that had executed its most experienced officers, hollowed out by years of feeding a population its own ideology was starving, could not hold. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces entered Phnom Penh. The soldiers who walked into the city found a ghost town. The same city that had held 2.5 million people 4 years earlier was silent, empty. The streets smelled of abandonment and something worse. In the halls of S-21, the last prisoners, those who had not yet been transported to Choang Ek, were found where the guards had left them, throats cut in the final hours hastily, to erase evidence. The torture instruments were still in the rooms. The photographs were still on the walls. The confessions were still in the files. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge leadership fled west, toward the Thai border, into the jungle where they had spent years building a movement that had just killed a quarter of the country's population. The world watched and then largely looked away. This is a part of the story that does not fit neatly into the narrative of good and evil that war crimes histories usually tell, because the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge's fall was not the clean story of justice and reconstruction it should have been. The Vietnamese occupation that ended the genocide was itself a geopolitical problem for the United States and China and the Western powers who did not want to legitimize a Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh. The result was something almost incomprehensible in retrospect. The Khmer Rouge retained Cambodia's United Nations seat for years after genocide. The United States, Britain, and China provided diplomatic cover and, in some cases, material support to Khmer Rouge as a counterbalance to Vietnamese influence in the region. The men who had organized the killing fields attended UN functions in New York. They sat in negotiating rooms. They were treated as a political factor to be managed rather than as perpetrators of mass murder to be prosecuted. Pol Pot continued to lead the Khmer Rouge from the Thai-Cambodian border jungle for nearly 2 more decades. He directed guerrilla operations. He gave interviews occasionally to journalists who managed to find him, appearing soft-spoken, reflective, a grandfather figure who spoke in measured sentences about his love of Cambodia and expressed no remorse for what had occurred, framing the deaths as regrettable but necessary, insisting that accusations of genocide were Vietnamese propaganda. He had a daughter with his second wife. He lived in the jungle with a simplicity that his own ideology had always demanded, though the simplicity was somewhat relative given that he was protected by armed guards and supplied through Thai border networks. By the mid-1990s, the Khmer Rouge was fracturing. Defections multiplied as the Cambodian government offered amnesty. The organization that had once fielded an army of tens of thousands had shrunk to a few thousand fighters in remote border areas, sustained more by inertia than by any viable political project. Senior commanders began making their own accommodations with Phnom Penh. In 1997, Pol Pot ordered the execution of Sun Sun, a longtime Khmer Rouge leader, along with Sun Sen's entire family, 11 people. The killing of a family he had worked beside for decades provoked a final rupture. His remaining commanders turned on him. He was arrested by the remnants of the organization he had created and subjected to a mock trial, a brief, almost farcical proceeding, held in the jungle, before a crowd of soldiers, in which he was found guilty and sentenced to house arrest for life. A journalist named Nate Thayer reached him months later, in the last interview he would ever give. Pol Pot appeared old, frail, partially deaf. He sat in a plastic chair and denied any personal responsibility for what had happened in Cambodia. The deaths, the millions of deaths, had been carried out by his subordinates without his knowledge or authorization, he said. He had loved his country. He had worked for his people. His conscience was clear. He appeared entirely sincere. On April 15, 1998, Pol Pot died near the Cambodian-Thai border. The official cause was heart failure. No autopsy was performed. His body was cremated within hours on a pyre of tires and wood, before any independent verification of the cause of death could be conducted. Some investigators believed he had taken his own life upon learning that the Khmer Rouge intended to surrender him to an international tribunal. Others believed he had been poisoned by those same commanders who feared what he might say in open court. He was 72 years old. He had never faced justice. He had never been tried. He had never sat in a courtroom and heard the charges read against him. He had never been required to look at a single photograph from S-21 and account for the face in it. He died, as far as anyone could determine, at peace. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the hybrid tribunal established with UN support to prosecute the surviving senior Khmer Rouge leaders, began its work in 2007 and delivered its final judgments in 2022. 15 years of proceedings, 3 convictions. Dutch, the commandant of S-21, was convicted in 2010 and died in prison in 2020. Nuon Chia, known as Brother Number 2 and the man who had been Pol Pot's closest ideological ally, was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity and died in prison in 2019. Q Sam Phan, the head of state of Democratic Kampuchea, was convicted of genocide in 2022 at the age of 91. Justice came slowly, incompletely, and of very few. The ECCC was criticized throughout its existence for its cost, its pace, its limited reach, the political pressures that constrained its scope. A significant portion of the Khmer Rouge's middle and lower tier never faced any accountability at all. Many of them were quietly reintegrated into Cambodian society in the amnesty programs of the 1990s. Some of them live today in the villages of northwestern Cambodia, in the former Khmer Rouge strongholds near the Thai border. Their neighbors know who they were. The subject is not always discussed. The estimated death toll of the Khmer Rouge regime is a number that varies depending on the methodology and the source, and the variance itself tells a story about the difficulty of counting the dead when so many were buried in unrecorded graves across an entire country. The most commonly cited figures range from 1.7 million to 2 million. A 2009 report prepared for the ECCC by 2 Cambodian judges, using demographic analysis of population data from the period, found that approximately 3.3 million people, nearly half the population, had died during the Pol Pot years from all causes combined, including starvation, disease, and execution. The international body estimates most frequently referenced, including those of Yale University's Cambodian Genocide Program, settle at approximately 1.7 to 2 million direct deaths, roughly 20 to 25% of Cambodia's entire population, killed in under 4 years. There is no other event in the 20th century, including the Holocaust in proportional terms, where a government killed so large a share of its own people in so short a time. Walk into the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum today, and the first thing you encounter is the building's ordinariness. It looks like what was before a school. The classroom windows are the same classroom windows. The concrete walkways are the same walkways. The bougainvillea that grew in the courtyard during the school years grew there during the years of S-21 as well, indifferent to what was happening inside. The rooms themselves have been preserved largely as they were found in January 1979. In some of them, the iron bed frames are still bolted to floor, the frames to which prisoners were chained while they were interrogated. In others, the photographs cover every wall. Thousands of faces in grid formation, each face a person who arrived at this building and did not leave it alive. You are not prepared for the children. No description prepares you for the children in those photographs. There is a survivor, Bu Meng, who spent years returning to Slang to sit in the courtyard and speak with visitors. He survived because he was a painter, and Dutch needed someone to paint portraits of Pol Pot for the walls of the interrogation rooms. He watched others die around him for months. He watched his wife brought in and taken away and never saw her again. And he came back decade after decade because he said that if he did not come back and tell people what he had seen, his wife had died for nothing, and all the others had died for nothing, and he was not willing to let that be true. At Choang Ek, a path winds between the pits. Some of them still push fragments of bone and cloth upward through the soil after heavy rains. The earth still giving back what was put into it 40 years ago. The stoop at the center is lit from inside, and through its glass panels you can see the arrangement of skulls. Organized, labeled, carefully preserved, a monument to something that human beings did to other human beings within living memory, in a country that had once been called the Pearl of Southeast Asia. There is a placard at the site of the killing tree. Visitors leave bracelets on the branches, flowers, small offerings. The tree stands in the middle distance of the quiet field, in the shadow of the sugar palms, and it is both an ordinary tree and the most unbearable thing in the landscape. What does a man like Pol Pot tell us about ourselves? He was not, by the testimony of those who knew him in his youth, a monster. He was quiet, gentle, even. He had a warm smile. His students loved him. He played music. He had a vision for his country that he had spent years developing in the jungle, away from comfort, away from the world, in conditions that most ideologues would have found sufficient reason to give up and go home. He was, by every measure, absolutely committed to what he believed. What he believed was that human beings could be sorted, that some were pure and some were contaminated, and that the contaminated ones were a threat to the pure ones, and that the threat could only be resolved one way. He believed this so completely that when the killing began, he called it transformation. He believed it so completely that when he was dying, half deaf in a plastic chair in the jungle, he said his conscience was clear. That clarity of conscience is the thing that haunts, more than the numbers, which are too large for the mind to hold, more than the photographs, which are too specific for the heart to process. The haunting thing is the man who organized all of it and felt at the end that he had loved his country well. The Cambodian people did not get to choose what was done to them in the name of Khmer purity and year zero and the vision of a soft-spoken man who had failed his radio electronics courses in Paris and found something else to study instead. They went to the rice paddies and they starved and they watched their children taken and their temples destroyed and their money dissolved and their world erased. And they had no words for what was happening to them because the Khmer Rouge had eliminated the vocabulary of protest from the country entirely. What they had instead was memory, the particular, indestructible memory of people who had survived something that the perpetrators assumed would leave no witnesses. The witness is Cambodia itself. Still there, still growing rice in the paddies of the Northwest, still rebuilding the institutions that were destroyed in 4 years and that have taken 40 to begin to reconstruct. A country with missing generation. The doctors, the teachers, the lawyers, the engineers, the artists, everyone who wore glasses, whose absence is still felt in the country's capacity to manage its own affairs decades later. A country where a significant portion of the population is under 35, because so many of the people who would have been older were killed before they could have children. Pol Pot dreamed of year zero. The Cambodians who survive him are still counting from it. And in the courtyard of what was once a high school and then a death factory and is now a museum, the bougainvillea continues to grow, season after season, indifferent to everything that has happened in the rooms beyond its reach, putting out its red flowers in the dry season and its green leaves in the wet. It was there before. It will be there after. But the faces on the walls will not go away. Bu Meng understood something essential about why he had to keep coming back. Because memory is not the opposite of the thing that was done. Memory is the only answer to it. That does not require anyone to become what was done to them. The killing fields are quiet now. The birds move through the sugar palms in the late afternoon, and the light comes down golden to the leaves, and everything looks, if you do not know what you're standing on, like peace. You know, and that is the point. That is exactly the point.